It's time now for Perspective, and we're sticking with our top story today as we head into Joe Biden's last few days, or last day rather, in Brussels, where he's due to meet EU leaders. That after a NATO summit dominated by the security threat posed by China. My guest today is Sven Biscop, Director of the Europe in the World programme at the Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, which is also known as the Egmont Institute. Thank you so much for being with us on France 24 today. Is Biden, do you think, getting what he wants out of his Europe trip so far?
Well, of course, everybody is very keen to work with Biden, that is clear. But it strikes me that while, for example, the NATO Secretary General and Biden's entourage are doing their best to play up how strong the language on China is that NATO has produced and the G7, that in reality the language is quite nuanced. So it seems that actually the strategic divergence is some there, and that Europeans are not quite ready to be as tough on China as probably Biden expected them to be.
And is that going to be hard for President Biden going forward? We know Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, also Emmanuel Macron, French President, they are, I think you'll agree, some of the people who've been pushing back a little bit against Biden's insistence on China's threat.
Indeed, I think what the US administration is trying to do is to somehow present world politics as a clash between the Democrats and the dictators, so to say. But if that were true, then why are we allying with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, and so forth? So I think the reality is this is about interests, and the interests of Europeans and Americans are not entirely the same. And that's why we will have to, I think, see this first visit as the start of a process rather than as a turning point.
And how significant do you think this shift is to focusing on the threat posed by China? Because we're used to hearing about the threat posed by Russia, but not so much by China.
I think the reality is that NATO as a military alliance will continue to focus very much on deterring Russia. Because if you look at the instruments that we have to use vis-à-vis China, it's more about our economic positioning. It's also about building up cyber defenses. It's about reacting to hybrid actions. But most of the expertise and even the legal authority is not with NATO. Then it's with individual states or with the European Union. Diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions. So I think the reality will be that this is a strong declaration on the part of NATO, but the practice of policy will probably stay with individual states and with the European Union.
And the language regarding China in the NATO communique that we heard was much stronger than in the G7 communique. Do you think that Biden has found a more captive audience with NATO than with the G7, despite all the problems we've just discussed?
Probably many Europeans see this as somehow the price to pay to keep the US interested in NATO, because of course we need the American contribution to deterring Russia. But what strikes me is that we're not talking about the real implication of the American focus on China. I mean, it is clear that for the United States, the competition with China is the number one priority, and that mostly plays out in Asia. So in a very hypothetical scenario that you have a crisis in Asia and Europe at the same time, it is quite possible that the Americans will prioritize Asia, not Europe. And this means that inside NATO, the Europeans will have to do a lot more to take care of the first line of defense, which will have to be European. That's the real implication of the American shift in strategy.
And we know, of course, that transatlantic relations were very much damaged under Donald Trump, who called the very existence of NATO into question on numerous occasions. Joe Biden has said that the US has a sacred commitment to NATO to come to the defence of its NATO allies. Is that going to be reassuring enough for his partners in NATO, do you think? Is that what they needed to hear?
That was indeed very, very strong language, and I'm sure that he means that, although of course Europeans are also a bit wary what will happen in 2024 in the presidential elections. Nonetheless, we must of course use the moment to forge ahead and cooperate with the US as much as we can. That is clear.
Now, Biden's meeting with EU leaders later this Tuesday. What are the main things that you'll be looking out for at the end of that meeting?
Well, first of all, I think it's very positive that we have these summits back to back, and that Biden realizes that if you want to work with Europeans, there's no point in trying to artificially channel everything through NATO. That on many topics, the EU is the one that you want to talk to. What I will be looking forward to is whether there will be some agreement on sanctions, because it's bizarre that among such close partners, the US continually uses sanctions against Europe. And I think if Biden really wants to create a lot of goodwill and cooperation, getting rid of those sanctions would be, for me, priority number one.
And we're hearing about a possible trade breakthrough. Is that something you're expecting to see today?
Well, for sure, here also I hope for a breakthrough, but at the very least it will be a start of the process. For now, we don't really know yet what will be Biden's agenda for the multilateral trade system, for the World Trade Organization, and so on. And I think Europe is very convinced that we are an open economy. We want to maintain that, and we want to be able to trade and invest with everybody, and that requires an adaptation of the WTO.
Now, the question of Ukrainian membership of NATO did come up yesterday, with Biden saying the country had to sort out corruption before it could consider becoming a member. Is that something Kiev was expecting to hear, do you think?
I think that Kiev should probably not have been expecting anything, because everybody knows that on paper there's the open door policy, but that in reality inviting either Ukraine or Georgia to join NATO would only make relations between NATO and Russia more difficult. Of course, Russia has no veto, but if you want to extend membership, you have to know what you're getting into. I think the sad reality is that a country like Ukraine is a buffer state between NATO and the EU on the one hand and Russia on the other hand, and it will probably remain a buffer state for some time to come.
And of course, we are all very closely watching that meeting with Joe Biden and President Vladimir Putin in Geneva on Wednesday. Harsh words already issued from both sides. Are you expecting that meeting to be as explosive as some people think it will be?
I think when they are sitting face to face, it will probably not be that explosive. I think what we can hope for is that they would start maybe a process of negotiations, of talks, for example, on arms control. And if they set a date for another meeting or for their foreign ministers to meet, I think that would already be a good achievement. As long as we are talking, that greatly reduces the risk of any escalation or incident.
Sven Biscop, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Sven Biscop, Director of the Europe in the World programme at the Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, also known as the Egmont Institute. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.